Take your Bibles and open to Acts chapter 25. Acts chapter 25. Now this is the second trial of Paul. He's going to go through 3 trials. This is trial number 2. Actually, from this to the end of the book is all about Paul getting to Rome. Okay? So we see 3, if we wanted to look at this in the context of a play, we have 3 acts. And the first act would be a hateful visit in Jerusalem. So let's take a look at verse 1 of chapter 25. Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now we need to understand the difference here between Festus and Felix. They're both short names, both have 5 letters, both begin with an F, but they're day and night difference. Felix was a terrible ruler. He was greedy, he was dishonest, he was murderous, he was just bad in every way. History is much kinder to Festus. He comes out looking much, much better than Felix. He was a good man, he had a good heart, he wanted to do the right thing, which is why after 3 days in Caesarea, remember last week, he came in and replaced Felix. Apparently Felix had been complained on by the Jews enough that they finally said enough is enough. Get rid of Felix, and they brought in Festus. So after 3 days in Caesarea, he goes to Jerusalem to see how things are going. He knows that there's a problem there, and he wants to go and be proactive in solving that problem. Now you'll notice here, as we go along, that this is about 2 years after Paul had his trial under Felix. So 2 years in Caesarea, and then here comes Festus. Now, Luke doesn't give us any information about what happened during those 2 years. It's really not his purpose. The purpose of Luke in the book of Acts is to bring Paul to Rome. So that really doesn't matter what he did for those 2 years. It's not germane to the discussion of how we get Paul to Rome. So here we go. We have a strong beginning. He spends 3 days in Caesarea, and then he makes his trip up to Jerusalem, which is followed by a deceitful request on the part of the Jews in verses 2 and 3. In verse 2, it says, Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. So they're asking him to bring him for a trial, but what they really have in mind is killing him. So the Jews inform him, the Jews have a petition, and then they have a plot, and they want to kill him. Now, think about this for a minute. Paul's been to Caesarea for 2 years. He escaped to Caesarea under a watch of about 470 soldiers because they had 40 plus men, had made a covenant that they wouldn't eat anything or drink anything till they killed Paul. So at least they got him out of their hair. He's in Caesarea now for 2 years, but still, after 2 years, they still hate him enough that they want to murder him. Where does this kind of hate come from? Why can't they be satisfied with the fact that he's gone, he's history, he's out of Jerusalem? They hate him so bad that they want to kill him. And as I thought about this kind of hatred, we need to understand where it really comes from. And I can give you 3 explanations. Number 1, well, let's take a look at where we are on the map. Remember, they're in Jerusalem. Paul's down here in Caesarea. Festus comes. He goes up to Jerusalem, and he confers with them, tries to see what's going on with them, and they want him to go back and get Paul and bring him back so that they can kill him. Okay? But where are we looking as far as this hatred? Okay, first of all, it's a natural enmity. In Genesis 3:15, God said, I'll put enmity or hatred between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And the seed of the woman would be believers, the seed of the serpent would be unbelievers. So there's a natural enmity, there's a natural dislike, even hatred, if you will, between or in the hearts of unbelievers for believers. If you have unbelieving friends or family members that just seem to hate you for no reason, that's a good possibility. It's just a natural enmity between believers and unbelievers. There's also, it's a family trait. In John 8:44, Jesus says, You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and it does not stand in the truth. So it's a family resemblance. Believers have Satan as their father, so they're going to do the things that Satan wants them to do. They're going to have the attitudes and the hatreds that Satan wants them to have. And finally, there's that hatred because they hate the light. John 3:20 says, "For everyone who practices evil things hates the light and does not come into the light, lest his deeds should be exposed." Now, what has that got to do with the believer? I'll tell you. In Matthew 5:14, Jesus said what? "You are the light of the world." 2 verses later, he says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." And if we're the light of the world, and the world hates the light, the world wants to be in darkness, what happens when you come on the scene? You're bringing the light with you. And your good works give glory to God and expose their bad works. So they don't really want you around. That's just the way it is. I remember when I was in college, every Wednesday night, we would all pile into my buddy's Camaro, and we would cruise up and down the main drag there in the little town of Wyoming drinking beer. And when I became a believer, I decided it was time for me to stop drinking. But I still wanted the fellowship of my friends. But I noticed they would start leaving the dorm without me. They didn't want me around anymore. So the light of the world brings light on sin and makes them look bad, so they hate you. So this is just some thoughts I had, helping us understand this unnatural hatred that they had for Paul. That 2 years later, they still are burning with the desire to kill him. So we have a strong beginning for Festus, and then we have a deceitful request on the part of the Jews, and then we have a strong finish for Festus in verses 4 and 5. Verses 4 and 5 says this: "But Festus answered that Paul should be kept in Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there be any fault in him." So he's sticking to his guns. He says, if you want to see Paul, if you want to interview Paul, if you want to have a trial, if you want me to try Paul before you, then you come with me. We'll go down together to Caesarea and see what you can do then. So he makes a decision and he gives them an invitation. So with so much hatred against believers, I'm glad that he who is in me is greater than he who is in the world. Okay? So this is Act 1, a hateful visit to Jerusalem where they pour out their hatred for Paul and they're designed to kill him. And then we have the second trial here in Caesarea beginning in verse 6. Festus returns in verse 6. It says, "And when he remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought." So he's hanging out there with the Jews for another 10 days or so, and then he goes down, they go down with him. He takes his seat at the judgment seat, which makes this a formal trial, and he has Paul brought forward. And then the Jews begin to accuse him in verse 7. It says, "When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove." There's nothing new here. This is exactly the same thing that happened before Felix. They bring all these charges that they can't prove. But it's exactly what happened to the Lord. In Luke 23:2, they began to accuse him, Jesus, saying, "We have found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king." None of this is true. It's interesting how Luke brings out the things in the life of the Apostle Paul that are parallel to the life of Christ. Same thing happened to both. They were both falsely accused. They both had people who wanted to kill them. And Paul is here in Caesarea, and they're doing the same thing. They're multiplying. The difference between this trial and the trial of Phoenix is here they say many evil things. They're just throwing more and more stuff at Paul, hoping something will stick. Nothing can stick because he is innocent. So we have this on the part of the Jews. They make this serious complaints, and they have no proof, according to verse 7. They could not prove anything. So we come to Paul's answer now in verse 8. It says in verse 8, while he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar, have I offended in anything at all. He's saying, I haven't violated any laws, I haven't violated any temple laws, and I haven't violated any citizenship laws. Now the last claim that he makes is the most important, because he says here, neither again nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. Because if he had offended against Caesar, that's treason. That's the death penalty. So he saved the best for last, but he's saying basically, I'm innocent. Same thing that he said before Felix. He answers and pleads his innocence. Now at this point, Festus could have turned him loose. Festus knows that they've got no charges. They know they've got no charges. They know that their case is very weak, which is why they wanted to kill him in the first place. So he does falter, though, unfortunately, in verse 9. It says in verse 9, but Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? And Paul's not going to do that. He's not going to fall for that. For three reasons at least. Number one, it's dangerous. If he goes up with the Jews to Jerusalem, you know, Festus is still not really completely up to speed on all this. He doesn't know the depth of their hatred for him. He doesn't know about the plot of 2 years before. So he's probably only going to have a smaller escort to take him up there. They're hiding in the way they're going to kill him. So Paul said, no, this is not safe. They'll kill me if I agree to this. Another thing, if Paul goes to Jerusalem, the chances of him getting a fair trial are quite remote. And third reason, Paul's been languishing here in Caesarea for 2 years. Enough is enough. We've already had 2 trials now. They couldn't prove anything in either trial. It's time for you to set me free and let me be on my way to Rome. Okay? So this is where Festus begins to falter a bit. Now, part of the problem, if you look at verse 20, he says in verse 20, and because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. So in his defense, Festus is trying to do the right thing, and he understands that he doesn't really know everything that he needs to know about the Jewish culture, the Jewish laws, the religion, and everything like that. So he's trying to help. He's trying to do what will do the best thing. But his idea here is to please the Jews. And that's never a good thing, to try to please people when you know this guy is innocent. So he offers a change of venue. Let's go up to Jerusalem. Now we have other instances of people who yielded to a mob of people when they shouldn't have. One is Herod. In Mark 6:25 or 6:26, the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. This is, of course, the Herod that had John the Baptist killed. He liked John the Baptist. He would bring John the Baptist in often and talk with him and converse with him. He liked him. He personally liked him. And then he threw a party one day, and his stepdaughter comes in, and she does some kind of a lewd dance for everybody there, pleases everybody. And so he wants to reward her. So he says, what do you want? And ask me whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. And she confers with her mother, who hates John the Baptist, because John the Baptist had criticized her marriage to Herod because it was unlawful for them to be married. So her mother says, ask for the head of John the Baptist. So Herod has to have him delivered up. But he yields to do the wrong thing. He yields to a crowd of people who he shouldn't have yielded to. Another one was Peter himself. In Matthew 26:70, but he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. Of course, you know what this refers to. This is when Jesus is on trial before the high priest. Peter's out in the courtyard warming himself by a fire. 3 times they tell him, we know who you are. We know that you're one of his disciples. And he denied 3 times that he knew him. So another case of someone yielding to the wrong crowd of people. And finally, we have Pilate, which has as part of our scripture reading this morning. Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was arising, took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person, you see to it. And of course, he knew again that Jesus was not guilty. Jesus was innocent. That Jesus was a righteous man. But he lays down and turns over the responsibility to the Jewish people. So this is where Festus falters. That's the close of Act 2. Act 3, we have a fateful decision made by Paul. In verse 10 and 11, Paul answers Festus. He says in verse 10, so Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. Now, anytime you have a trial anywhere in a Roman province with a Roman governor, that's Caesar's seat. Any place. You're under his protection, you're under his laws. And the laws were very liberal toward their citizens. They really protected their citizens. In fact, the reason why Festus asked him, would you be willing to go, was because if you're standing before a Roman governor and you're accused, you can't have a change of venue unless you agree to it. The governor cannot take you, well, I'm going to take you over here and examine you, or I'm going to take you over there and examine you. He has to go with wherever the accused wants to be tried. So he's in Caesarea. He says here in verse 11, he says that verse 10, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, which is where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself very well know. So he's throwing it back on Festus. He says, you know that I'm innocent. Okay? So he's answering him here. He's concerning his judgment, concerning his innocence, and concerning his rights in verse 11. In verse 11 he says, for if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying, but if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Now, like I said, Festus could have passed judgment. He could have said, there's nothing wrong with this guy. He's done nothing wrong. You've got no proof. I'm going to declare him not guilty. You Jews go back to Jerusalem